As Christ Community Church celebrates its 40th year, founding pastor Jim Nicodem has shared a series of talks with church staff about how God has been on the move over 4 decades. These are not meant to be sermons or in-depth theological studies, but instead are stories and reflections from a founding pastor. We now invite you to listen in as Pastor Jim shares what has been and what will continue to be the core legacy values of Christ Community Church.
I had the coolest dad on the block as a kid, and what made him so cool is because on a warm summer night when my buds, and I lived on a block with a lot of guys my age, and we would gather around on the patio, and my dad would tell stories about growing up in India. I mean, nobody else had a dad like that. So my dad could tell stories of cutting off the heads of poisonous snakes that showed up in the corner of the classroom. Or, he could talk about, he would speak sometime in Hindi, and that would freak everybody out. Or flying kites in the Himalaya mountains, doing kite fights. Have to explain that to you afterwards if you can't imagine that. And being the son of a missionary dad who had a reputation as a tiger hunter. You just see my buddy's eyes get big as he'd tell those stories. A story I didn't learn till many years later when I was a pastor on Cape Cod, Massachusetts. My grandpa died when my dad was just 11, 12 years old. So I never knew him. But I ran into a guy on Cape Cod who was a retired missionary from India. And he was a friend of my grandfather's. And some of you may have heard me tell this story before, but the story that he told me, I just loved. And that was, he said, your grandfather invited me to go tiger hunting with him. And so I said, I don't know anything about it. And he said, I'll teach you anything you need to know. So he said, we went out and we found some tracks and they led to a cave. And your grandfather said, okay, here's how we're going to play this out. He said, tigers like to hide in caves. And they usually pick a cave that's got a back entrance as well as a front entrance in case they need an escape route. So I'm going to put you up in this tree here. So he boosts him up, puts him in a lower limb. And he said, I want you to point your gun at the entrance to the cave, okay? I'm going to go around the back of the cave. I'm going to make some noise. The tiger's going to come bolting out and just pull the trigger, okay? That's all you got to do. So he says, your grandpa goes back around the back of the cave and he makes some noise. This tiger comes bolting out of the entrance of the cave. And he said, I was so scared I fell out of the tree. And he said, I thought, I'm a goner. And then all of a sudden I heard boom, boom, and your grandfather killed him. And so I don't know, can you trust a missionary, an ex-missionary? Was that a true story? It was a pretty cool story. But my friends, were mesmerized. And so here, my dad's son of missionary parents. So I grew up in a home where gospel ministry around the world was talked about, prayed about, financially supported. We had missionary friends dating back to his days in India. And whenever they were on the States on furlough, they would stay at our house. This is the 9th installment in the Legacy Values series. Guess what I'm going to talk about? Yes, international impact. So for me, the II values started as a kid growing up in the home of a dad who'd grown up on the mission field. I attended a couple of Bible teaching churches. In fact, they both had Bible in the name as a boy, and they had a whole slate of missionaries. And it had absolutely zero impact on me with respect to international ministry. And I'll explain why it was so ineffective a little bit later. But when I got to high school, as I grew up, when I got to high school, my mom got a job as the executive assistant to the president of World Relief. Some of you are familiar with World Relief. It's like World Vision, but they do relief work around the world, which is why they call it World Relief. But she had to do some international travel, and then she had to do some hosting. One of the people that she hosted was World Relief's guy in Bangladesh. That was my experience missions-wise in high school. Then in college, I finally got around to surrendering my life to Jesus as a freshman, and I really wanted to serve him, and so I signed up for a summer program at Wheaton College called Youth Hostel Ministry. And I was on a team of 4 Wheaton students, and we were put down at a Christian youth hostel in the middle of the red light district of Amsterdam. And that's where I spent 3 months that summer. And it was just basically looking to open conversations with people about Jesus, students buying a Eurail pass or hitchhiking their way through Europe. And I remember coming back from that summer really jazzed about seeing what God was doing in other cultures and telling God, I think I could see myself doing ministry full time as long as it's any place other than the United States. Okay, as long as it's someplace else, I'd really like to do that. So then I met Sue. I became engaged to Sue. Sue had been following Jesus since high school and had always wanted to be, since surrendering to Christ, a missionary to Africa. And so she had some French-speaking country in Africa on her mind. So she was taking French and whatnot. And as our wedding approached, because we got engaged, I think it was our junior year, I suggested to her that maybe after we get married, we go work with friends of my parents who were lifelong missionaries in Pakistan. So she thought that was a cool idea, and I did too. And so we contacted these friends, and they said no. And they said there's no way that anybody should start married life off in a country of militant Muslims. Just not a good place to get started. So that kind of put the kibosh on that. But at the same time, my pastor was doing our pre-marriage counseling, and he said to me, I know you've got a passion for international ministry, but have you ever thought about the fact that gets supported by churches in this country? And he said, the pastors who've really got a passion for that and who know how to cast a vision for it are few and far between. So maybe God wants you to be a pastor here in the States and do something for international ministries. And I thought, okay, that made sense to me. And eventually we started Christ Community Church. And for the first 8 or 9 years, we did absolutely nothing that had to do with international ministries, because we had a tiger by the tail, and it was just trying to keep up with what God was doing in this new local church that we had started. But Sue and I, while Christ Community was going, and we were meeting in this movie theater on weekends and whatnot, we started to give toward a ministry that was going on in Romania. So this interest in international ministries, even though not reflected in the church at the time, was still a underlying passion in my life. And so I decided to take a trip to Romania and scout this ministry out. And if you stuck your head in while our international partners were here a month ago, I told this story, but I'll tell it again. I'd met a Romanian who had emigrated to this country named Mircea. He'd been in the country like 3 years. So he still spoke very broken English. And I said, Mircea, I want to go to Romania and check up on this ministry that Sue and I have been supporting. Would you be my translator? So he said, sure. So he had a favorite line. And the whole time we traveled for like 2 weeks in Romania, anytime a difficult situation would arise, he would look at me and he'd go, no problem, Pastor Jim, no problem. So I thought, okay, Mircea doesn't think this is a problem, so this is cool. I mean, it started, we got off the plane and we got picked up by Christians in this beater car, and we got like a mile from the airport and we had a flat tire. And he looks at me and goes, no problem, Pastor Jim. So they're changing the tire and the police show up. And I'm thinking, well, this is good. In the United States, the police show up and they put flares out and well, not in Romania. Okay, Ceausescu had just been deposed 6 months earlier and assassinated, okay? So we're in this country now that's very communistic, and they're looking for payola. And they're talking about taking us to prison unless we give them money. And Mircea's looking at me and saying, no problem, Pastor Jim, So this went on for 2 weeks. But here's the funny part of the story. We're coming home, on the airplane coming home, and as we're flying over the Atlantic, all of a sudden the pilot comes out, and we're flying to Rome Airlines, the unfriendly skies of Romania. And it's like a European bus. It's the you know how carefully they shut the overhead compartments in a plane? Not when you're flying to Rome. They're all stuff's hanging out of them and whatever. So the pilot comes across in Romanian and he says something, and I see a shocked look on everybody's face. And Mircea turns to me and he says, "Big problem, Pastor Jim." It's like, well, you never said this at all. So what's the big problem? And we were running out of gas over the Atlantic. And so they hadn't calculated it appropriately. They'd run into headwinds. And so we had to put down at Gander Air Force Base, which, look at a map sometime. It is the easternmost part of the North American continent sticking out into the Atlantic. It was the only place that we could get to. It was a one lane at the time airstrip. And meant for military, smaller military, not a great big passenger plane. So we put it down and, they refilled us. And I'm wondering how in the world we landed and we came to the end of the runway. Now, what do you do? And so he did a U-turn with the airplane, and everybody's kind of looking out their window. That's a very short runway. And sure enough, I think there were tree branches in the wheels when we finally cleared, but that was big problem, Pastor Jim. So that was the beginning of II at Christ Community Church. And along the way, what we've discovered is the most important thing is vetting partners that we're then going to work alongside. That has been the big deal for us. 5 criteria that we have used in vetting partners. First, I'm going to use the word limited. It's been a limited number of partners. So back to the 2 churches I grew up with. They had tons of missionaries. So I'm guessing 20 to 30 missionaries apiece, because I'm remembering, if you go out to the lobby of these, they didn't call them lobbies. What do they call them? Narthex? Yeah, something like that. Sounds like larynx. So they'd have these great big missionary maps, and there would be pictures of the missionaries around the outside and a piece of yarn stretching to the country with anybody else grow up in churches like this? Yeah. And here's the problem, okay? The problem from the church standpoint is when you got 30 missionaries, nobody knows them. Nobody. There's way too many for anybody to get to know. And they'd come home on furlough like every 5 years and then show this really weak slideshow on a Sunday night in a service that hardly anybody attended. Okay? And from their standpoint, we were basically nickel and diming them, right? So if you got 30 people, you're giving them a pittance. And so when they come home on furlough and need some rest and refreshment, they're having to travel all over the country and meet with their supporting churches to get, money back into the coffers. So it's just, it's a pretty bad plan. So we made up our mind at the beginning at Christ Community, we're going to start small, like 1 or 2 partners, and then the number eventually grew to 6. And when we got to 6, we said, that's it. We're working in 6 partner countries. We want to know these partners thoroughly, and we want to support them generously. So here's an application I want to slip in here, and that is, how well do you know our partners? We did a prayer when our partners were in town last month. One of our staff prayer times, I had you break up into groups. I think this was online, so it was probably a Tuesday pastoral staff time. And afterwards, I was thinking to myself, oh gosh, I wonder if some of the groups had a hard time figuring out what to pray for, because not everybody, especially if you're new here, knows our partners. So my challenge to you is get to know our partners. Jim and his team have done a wonderful job of posting information about those countries and our partners online so you can access them. If you're a pastoral staff member, just consider them to be a fellow pastoral staff member of Christ Community Church, because they are. They're just an extension of our staff. So we have focused on these six countries. Occasionally, we will do a one-off. Like back in 2016, there was a refugee crisis in Greece. They were overrun with Muslims coming in from Syria, and we sent a couple of teams there on that occasion. But for the most part, we've stuck to our 6 countries. Now, we encourage people at Christ Community Church, because you're always hearing from people, oh, I've got a friend who's a missionary and so. Could we have them come in and present and maybe support? Or I support this or that Christian organization overseas, and would we consider doing that? And so our response has been, listen, the 6 partners we have are what we do corporately, but there's no limit to what you can do individually if you want to. So, for years, Sue and I, we've made a practice, our tithe, the first 10% of our income goes to the church, out of which we pay our international impact and community impact ministries. But then Sue and I, we've just decided to give beyond that. So we give like a second 10%, and it gets divvied up among missionary friends that we had growing up We went to college with them, and then they ended up on the mission field. Or I've got a good bro who's, been discipling pastors in Latin America and South America for years. There are missions organizations that we really dig that are working overseas. So there's nothing that stops you from doing that. So I encourage you, if you went to school, college with a missionary, someone who's now on the mission field, support them. But these are the ones that we're going to work with as a church. One of the organizations that Sue and I love to support is Voice of the Martyrs. And so I want to say a brief word about 3 partner organizations that are outside of our 6 countries. I'm trying to remember, Jim, do we call them ad hoc partners? What do we call them? Affiliates. Okay. And there are 3 of those. And they're ministries that don't have a face for us so much. Like our 6 partner countries have a face. I'm going to get to the faces in a moment. But Voice of the Martyrs, because they serve persecuted Christ followers around the world. Faith Comes by Hearing, because we work with them to get God's word translated into other languages. We have done multiple languages, getting the Bible translated into new languages, and then committed to audio Bibles. And again, the story of our last missions pastor, Eric Hansen, who passed away in Brazil delivering audio Bibles. So that's been a part of who we are. And then we work a lot with Samaritan's Purse. We just love the way that they dovetail humanitarian care with the spread of the gospel. And so they're boots on the ground. When a crisis happens, they're there. And so none of those 3 I mentioned fit in the bucket of the 6 countries that we work with, but I wanted to mention them. So limited number. Second criteria, we were looking for ministries that are indigenously led. So back to the churches I grew up in, all of the missionaries they supported were Americans who were serving in foreign countries. And, I don't say that derogatorily, like, oh, those losers, they were dear people. But what it meant was they were spending years learning the language, years adjusting to the culture, years overcoming the distrust, like, oh, you Americans are bringing your foreign religion into my country. They had problems trying to figure out how to educate your kids. I mean, my dad, though he grew up in India, was sent away 9 months of the year to a boarding school. That's how missionaries, the only way they could provide at the time. You couldn't send your kid to a local school where they didn't know the language and whatever. And then in addition to all that, it's just so expensive to support Americans living abroad. You not only have their daily living expenses, but then they're traveling back and forth to the United States, and that's very expensive. So when you work with indigenous leaders, your dollars stretch so much further. Okay, by the way, one last benefit of this indigenously led, it keeps us from being paternalistic. So we don't go to show people how to do ministry. When we go on Go Teams and whatever, we work under the leadership of the people we come alongside. They're the ones who know how to reach their culture best. And so our job is to support. Doesn't mean we don't hold them accountable, that we're not there to check things out, make sure it's all going well. We are scrupulous on those counts, but they're the leaders of the ministries we work alongside. Third criteria, evangelistic. So back to my first trip to Romania. I think it was 1990 because Ceausescu fell in 89. But I get there and I discover that the ministry that Sue and I have been giving generously toward for years is working with very, very, very conservative churches. In fact, I would go so far as to say legalistically conservative churches. So we're visiting the churches that we've been supporting, and it's mostly old people, and it's ladies in babushkas and no jewelry, no makeup, and they had a defensive posture toward their culture. And it was understandable because they'd been living under communism. So they had this fortress mentality in order to survive, but there was no outreach going on. Broke our hearts. Funny story that came out of this, and it goes back to the plane trip where we ran out of gas. So I'm sitting next to Mircea on the plane as we're flying home. And I look across the aisle, and there was this young woman sitting like 2 rows up, And she had turned around in her seat and she was talking very animatedly to the guy in the row behind her. And I looked at her and I thought, she's radiant. I will bet she's a Christ follower. She just had a look like she loved Jesus, I don't know. And so I bumped Mircea and I go, Mircea, because, you speak the language. I can't hear what's going on there. I said, I think she's a Christian. And Mircea looks and he goes, no. And I said, well, no, you didn't even listen. Like what? He goes, she's wearing jewelry, Pastor Jim. And I'm like, whoa, because she's wearing jewelry, she can't be a Christ. So we got into a very heated debate at 35,000 feet. And while we're debating back and forth, true story, she reaches into her backpack and pulls out a Bible and turns around and is explaining it to the guy behind her. Oh, I've never been so vindicated in my life. That was so much fun. All right. So we want to work with international impact partners who are all about the Great Commission, winning people to Christ. And that's not always the case. Just because a ministry is overseas doesn't mean they've got that goal. They can not only be ingrown like that ministry in Romania, they can also be so focused on meeting the physical and material needs of people that they sort of downplay or don't give much attention to spiritual needs, sharing the gospel. Here's a fourth thing we're looking for as we vet partners. Church-based. So back in 2010, huge earthquake in Haiti, country's devastated. We ended up sending 8 Go Team trips there in the course of 1 year. They did cleanup, they did medical, they built temporary shelters. We poured a ton of time and energy and money into the country, and it felt like it was all going down a black hole. And for a number of years working in Haiti, that's always how it felt. Like we're dealing with the tip of the iceberg, but nothing is ever changing here. Our initial ministry partner in Haiti was a dear doctor who ran an orphanage, a Haitian man, wonderful man, heartbreaking ministry to see these kids, growing up without parents and whatever. But it always seemed like we were addressing the symptom and we weren't getting to the root. So why are there so many abandoned kids? And why do people get stuck in poverty? And why is their country so characterized by corruption? The corruption down there, it just blows you away when you see it. So one of my first trips down there, we had just bought them a van. So give the orphanage a van so that they could cart kids around. So we get picked up at the airport and there are probably a dozen of us or so, and they cram us into 2 small cars. And I'm thinking, like, where's the van? We bought you a van, So we're driving to the orphanage, and all of a sudden, this is on a very busy street in Port-au-Prince, all of a sudden, our van goes driving by. And I'm like, that's our van. And they were like, yeah, it got stolen. And my first reaction, American, is, well, why didn't you go to the police? They look at you like, really? You need an education in this regard? The police are not going to do anything about it. So so the corruption in that country, the systems are so broken down, and they're not going to get fixed by ministries that simply provide homes for kids and medical supplies and education and whatever. Churches are needed. Because churches provide this stability. They disciple people holistically. They rebuild broken marriages. They teach people financial management like FPU. They give people a sense of purpose and mission. They teach them how to serve, not just to be on the receiving end, but to be serving others. And after working with this orphanage for a number of years, we asked Samaritan's Purse, hey, we want to work with a church. Do you know any good churches we could work with? And Samaritan's Purse, who had been in the country for years and years, said, it's very hard to find healthy churches here. And so we looked and we looked and we looked, and God led us across the path of Pastor Will John. And that was such a godsend. Yes, he is doing orphanage work and he's doing job training and medical care and so on, but he's doing it in the context of a supportive community. God's community, the local church. Love it. So we faced a similar situation, a challenge in Czech Republic, but for a different reason. So our ministry in Czech began there in 1998 when we sent our first Go Team to a summer English camp. So for those of you who are not initiated, the English camps that we do in several countries, often young people like to learn English. And so we go and it's, kind of a ELS, English, ESL course, but it engages them in conversation that allows us to talk about spiritual things as well. So that's what we were doing in the Czech Republic. But the question was always in the back of my mind is, okay, but what happens when these kids outgrow the youth ministry side of things? Like this Josiah venture, who we worked with, it was all about student ministry for the most part. There was one church we were working with in a town called Pisek, but it just seemed like it was short-sighted. Like, where's the church? We need healthy churches here. I remember after one English camp, going to the home of a young man who had attended the camp because he wanted me to meet his parents, and had this delightful conversation with his dad. But I'm talking to this guy thinking, it's wonderful that we reached his son this week, but who's going to reach him? Who's going to reach him? And so by God's grace, over the years, Josiah Venture has moved a little more in the direction of church planting. And now, one of the couples that was here a month ago for our International Impact Weekend, they were the pastors of the church that we work with there. And so it's just delightful to see, as we've placed an emphasis on church, we've kind of done a job, I think, of maybe holding others' feet to the fire in that regard as well. Church-based. Can't say enough about working with church-based ministries. So, Show preached to us a few weeks ago. 500,000 people come to faith in Christ, but you know what's even better? They've been baptized and enfolded into 11,000 churches. So here's a fifth characteristic. Okay, we're looking for partners that are Go Team friendly. So when we started ramping up International Impact in the early 90s, our partnerships meant two things. It meant, number one, we were going to give you money. We were going to support you financially, kind of send you some cash. And secondly, you would get training from me or a handful of other staff pastors who would travel to your country, and we would do a pastor's conference or whatever. So I don't know when it dawned on us, but these partners that we're developing, they probably benefit from the help of a team of people, not just pastors that we would send over to do conferences and whatever, but people who would go and do children's outreach and medical care, and they would build things construction-wise from schools to churches to latrines, people who would offer counseling. Our next trip to Nicaragua, the very next one that's taken off soon here is the one with 39 young people, but the one after that in April is a bunch of therapists going down to lead a pastor's marriage conference. And so we birthed Go Teams at that point. And for a few years, we just flew by the seat of our pants. It wasn't anybody's responsibility. It was on nobody's job description. We just sent Go Teams. And then eventually we realized there's got to be someone leading this ministry. And we looked around, and God led us to Eric Hansen. 2004, Eric and Carol developed a training guide that we still use today, right, Jim? Still using that training guide. I cannot watch any of the videos, though, or I totally lose it. Because Eric, you still get to see his face, his big smile, equipping people to go on a Go Team trip. So I remember talking to a friend of mine when we started doing these Go Team trips, pastor of a really large church. And on the side, one of his avocations, he was a chairman of the board of a large missions organization working in Europe. And I told him what we were doing, and he said, "That's a horrible idea." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Short-term missions where you send people from here over there." He said, it's a terrible waste of money. It's nothing but a paid vacation. People go and they come back and they talk for years afterwards about how they went to, Timbuktu. And he said, it does absolutely no good. And I remember coming back and talking to Eric and saying, "Eric, we got to make these things count." I mean, they've absolutely got to put added value into the lives of our partners. And our partners got to love the fact that we're coming, not like, oh no, another team that we got to entertain for a week. And here's the cool thing, you guys. We've got a reputation for doing that. You talk to any one of our partners, and they will tell you that we are the dearest people that come to their country to work. In fact, I've had a number of our partners tell me, we get teams from other places, other churches, Christian colleges, and whatever, and nobody serves like Christ Community. Like, you guys come with the biggest servant spirit. And I know that's traceable back to Eric Hansen and his legacy, and the way that we train people, and Jim Jarazal and his team now. And I say, yeah, that's so wonderful to have that kind of reputation. So one of the benefits, and I'm getting close to the close, Eric, so you get the idea. I could go on like all day on II stuff. But one of the benefits of doing Go Teams is that it spreads the value of II down throughout the whole church. We don't want this to be a value of the senior pastor or a value of a missions team. Like there's some Green Beret types that are really into missions, but it never works its way down. There have been hundreds of people now who've gone on Go Team trips. And when they come back, they pray harder for those partners, and they give more generously. And they come back fired up about sharing Christ with their next door neighbor because they've now shared Jesus down in Nicaragua. And so they come back with greater boldness. And so we want the entire church congregation to own this value. This is a value that I often say someday we'll get to heaven and we'll discover that what we did across our domestic campuses paled in comparison to what God accomplished through our partners, through us doing what we do with our partners around the world.
Thanks for joining us for this Legacy Value series. Check out the rest of these podcasts at ccclife.org/podcasts.